I'm going to move us from the world of information and digital technology to the world of biotechnology and talk to you about the emerging politics of human biotechnologies. But some of the themes are going to continue from what our last speaker talked about. We're going to continue to be really thinking about how do we apply our ethical and moral standards in a world where technology is developing very, very rapidly. And I'm also going to continue the theme of intellectual property. I'm going to start with patents, a question of gene patents. And I'm going to take us back to begin to 1955. On April 12th of that year, there was celebration across the United States. It was a day when people actually poured out into the streets and gathered in public places, and church bells were ringing. And this was all a celebration of the announcement that the field trials of Jonas Salk's polio vaccine had succeeded. So this was something that had been in the news. Americans had been following it avidly for years. And actually hundreds of thousands of volunteers had participated in these field trials, and millions of people had been contributing pennies and nickels and dimes at their grocery stores to the effort to vanquish this dread disease. So on this day, when the trial was declared a success, Dr. Salk was interviewed by Edward R. Murrow, the famous journalist of that day. And on his television show, See It Now, Murrow asked Salk, well, who owns the patent on this vaccine? And Dr. Salk's reply was, well, the people own it, I would say. There's no patent. Could you patent the sun? So that was in 1955, and things are really different a half a century later. Now, patents are a routine part of many ventures, especially in the life sciences. And in many cases, they're warranted. As Mitch said, this is a way to protect people's work and protect people's investments. That's the idea of patents, is to encourage innovations, of course. But there are some troubling things about the way patents have begun to be granted. Today, there are patents not just on vaccines, not just on drugs, but also on a number of things, many things actually, that were once considered way beyond the scope of property law. And we're talking about things like life forms created in laboratories, everything from microbes to mammals. And also, there are patents on many kinds of human tissues and molecules. To many people, the most troubling kind of patents on human tissues are the patents on human genes. And in fact, thousands of these patents have already been granted by the Patent Office. There are now, estimates say that about 20% of all human genes actually have already been patented. I'm curious, how many people, by a show of hands, had heard some number like that? 20% of human genes, all the genes we share, are patented. So some people have, right? But it's a really different thing, you know, where the Salk vaccine, that whole story was being followed really closely. I think, you know, it's safe to say the majority of folks are not aware that this gold rush is actually happening. But that's changing. I think it will change more in part because the ACLU has brought a lawsuit challenging patents on human genes. The suit was first filed in 2009 by the ACLU and the Public Patent Foundation. The plaintiffs are a really interesting group of women's health organizations, basic researchers, patients, and they charge that the lawsuit is against a company called Myriad Genetics. And the suit claims that patents on the two human genes held, or two of the genes held by Myriad, which are associated with inherited forms of breast cancer and ovarian cancer, that these patents are unconstitutional and invalid. And the suit charges that these patents, and other patents by extension on human genes, actually stifle research and diagnostic testing, and that they limit women's options about their own medical care. So the suit has been making its way through the courts. There have been several rulings by federal courts already, some of them quite extraordinary decisions. And right now, the ACLU has just announced that it's going to appeal a decision that went against it in one court to the Supreme Court. And we don't know whether the Supreme Court will hear it yet, but we do know that this question of patents on human genes is going to be, if not decided by the courts, it's probably going to come up in Congress, because it's a really key kind of question about the future of biotechnology. It affects the whole industry's future. Now, the legal arguments really do get into the weeds, and they turn on this question about whether patents are products of nature or whether they're human-made innovations. But I think that there are deeper ethical and moral questions that really is what bother us when we think about private companies owning and making profits on our genes. And I think these are captured and made more eloquent than most of us could do on first blush by a United Nations declaration that actually was voted on by the UN General Assembly back in 1998, as far back as that. This is called the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights. And it states that the human genome is the heritage of humanity and, quote, in its natural state shall not give rise to financial gains. So that's a pretty amazing statement. And it's also been, similar statements have been made by other international organizations that have looked at this question of patents on human genes. The World Medical Association, which is an umbrella group of the medical associations, national medical associations of 84 countries, says that human genes must be seen as mankind's common heritage. So this idea of a common heritage, of the commons, I think is a really critical one as we think about a lot of the questions that Mitch brought up and a lot of the other questions that I'm going to talk about in terms of human biotechnology. And I think it stands for a kind of broad moral and ethical question that we need to bring to a lot of different issues related to human biotechnologies. And what I have seen in the work that I've done at the Center for Genetics and Society, a public interest organization, over the last decade, is that we have a tendency to narrow these very profound questions to technical questions and procedural questions. So we think about, does a gene test count as a product of nature? Or we think about safety standards in a biotech lab. We think about procedural things like informed consent. But those are all really important. But we also need to take it deeper. We also need to think of the moral questions, the ethical questions, the social questions, the consequences of the decisions we make about technology as we move into this biotech century, as it's been called. So what I'm going to do now, I wanted to start with patents because I think it connects to the open source theme. But what I want to do now is kind of take you on a real whirlwind tour of some of the other issues surrounding human genetic and human reproductive technologies that are in the news. And if you start looking for them, you'll find them. But that often we come across in a kind of fragmented way. And my argument, the argument of a lot of the folks that I work with, is that we need to have a coherent, cohesive approach to these questions about human biotechnologies. We need a new politics of human biology, a new biopolitics. So I'm going to show you some of the highlights on that landscape. It's going to go fast. Okay, we're going to start with DNA forensics. Now, DNA technologies are supposed to be this new gold standard for police forensics, and this is one of the balancing acts. Genetic technologies in police work are often important. They have exonerated people who have been falsely convicted of crimes, including scores of people on death row. And genetic forensics is also important in identifying people who actually have committed crimes. If you're matching a DNA sample at a crime scene to a suspect and you have a match, you're likely to have the right person, although mistakes are made, and they're made often. And just last week in the UK, there was a story about a guy who spent months in jail because a lab worker had contaminated a sample. But there are much broader social issues that arise when we start thinking not of matching a crime scene sample to a suspect's DNA, but when we realize that police are actually building massive, massive databases of DNA samples. And the law is increasingly saying that police can and sometimes are mandated to collect DNA samples from a person that is merely arrested for a crime. They're not convicted. They're not even charged, but you can still be required to hand over your DNA sample. Now, this is a threat to, I think, all our civil liberties, but when you think about the communities who are in disproportionate contact with the criminal justice system, minority communities, you can see that it's also a question of racial justice. People who are more frequently in contact with the police, they're more likely to have their samples in these DNA databases. And now we're starting to see the adoption of techniques like the one called familial searching in DNA databases. So not just you, but your relatives are under this kind of genetic surveillance. Okay, so this is one technology. I'm going to move from here to a lot of questions about race and genetics. When the announcement that the human genome had been sequenced was made back in 2000, the scientists that were involved and the President of the United States made a point of saying that the evidence has confirmed what we have thought for a long time, that human beings are actually not naturally divided into identifiable racial groups. That in terms of biology, there is a single human race. But 12 years later, in fact, genetic scientists are continuing to use racial categories, and they use them in ways that often don't make a lot of sense. And I won't go into the details of that now. But the concern of a lot of people who are looking at this is that these kind of unjustifiable uses of racial categories threatens to revive old ideas, discredited ideas of race as a biological category rather than race as a category of history, politics, power. So this is an ongoing debate in the world of biotechnology, but meanwhile, products are coming on the market, including drugs that are marketed and approved by the FDA in one case as race-specific drugs. And the evidence for that is so sketchy that it's really shocking that it was approved by the FDA. And actually it was a flop. But nonetheless, we have this is one example of products that are coming, biotech-related products that are coming online that also can make people think that somehow race is written in our genes rather than race being written in our societies. Let's move on. Direct-to-consumer genetic tests. There are now more than 100 companies that are selling these online. You send in some of your spit and $100 or a few $100, and they send you back reports that give you your predictions of your risk for hundreds of conditions. Now, let me have another show of hands. How many people have, anybody here have sent away to 23andMe or Navigenics? A couple people here. Well, I'd be curious to talk with you afterwards about whether you think it was worthwhile. My sense is that many of the results that they report are not robust, not based on robust data. And some of the companies are reporting things that are actually out and out, misleading, like these ideas that the companies are going to be able to tell you based on your genes what foods you should eat, or better yet, what supplements you should buy from that company. This idea of nutrigenomics has been found, there's really little basis for that. But even the most reputable companies in this sector, I think, are many of the things they tell us are problematic. And the Government Accountability Office would agree with that. In the summer of 2010, they released the results of a study that they did that involved industry leaders like 23, including 23andMe and Navigenics. And what they did was really simple. They just took DNA samples from the same individuals, sent them to different companies, and guess what? They got back results that were, in some cases, completely different. And they also called the companies posing as consumers, asking questions about the reports, and the interpretations that they were given by the companies, in some cases, they said were highly misleading. Now, I'm not saying, and I want this to be really clear, gene tests can be really important parts of your health care for diagnosing single gene disorders, for finding out whether you have a particular genetic variant that's associated with an inheritable form of cancer, like the cancers that the Myriad company has on the breast cancer genes, the BRCA genes. There are cases where genetic tests are super important. But there's an emerging sense, and I don't think you can yet call it a consensus, but a growing sense among scientists that for predicting the risk of common complex diseases, genetic tests are not a good thing. They're not helpful. Take your family history. That's a much better way to do that than to take a gene test. And one of the concerns here, I mean, you waste a couple $100 and you're not going to miss your spit, but there are other concerns. And one of them, just to mention briefly, because it is a balancing act, is that these personal genomics, we're hearing all this grand promises about how they're going to, personal genomics is going to revolutionize healthcare, and direct-to-consumer gene test is going to be part of this. In many ways, a risk here is that we're going to be shifting our focus from the public health measures that have really, been what's improved our health and increased our lifespan, to this very narrow focus that's going to just make us all, the worried well and not really help our health. Okay, now let's see. There are I don't mean to pick on the silly examples, but that's what I'm going to do actually. There's some gene tests that are really ridiculous, like the ones that claim to tell you, are you going to be a super athlete? This sports X factor. There's about 100 companies that test for athleticism, and many of them test for one particular gene variant that's associated with fast twitch or slow twitch muscles, and fast twitch muscles are supposed to be good for things like sprinting, and slow twitch muscles are supposed to be good for things like endurance sports. But, really, is this going to, this one is marketed as groundbreaking performance, and I think it's questionable whether your genetic predisposition is going to really determine whether you make the varsity team or whatever it is. And particularly disturbing in this athleticism gene niche of the DTC, direct-to-consumer gene test market, are the companies like one called Atlas Sports Genetics, which aims its marketing at parents and encourages parents to get their toddlers tested so that the parents can then channel their one-year-olds into the right sport. And here we're starting to see a kind of use of genetic testing that I think raises all sorts of questions about really, intimate family issues, about what kind of parenting we're going to have. If you think your kid is going to be a sprinter and, push the kid into that sort of sport, are you doing something to that kid that's maybe not the best for it? But it gets, I think, worse quickly. Here's the Inborn Talent genetic test. This is a company based in Singapore, and this test says that it's testing your baby for dozens of gene variants that are going to tell what your child's inborn talents are, and it lists dozens of these genes in 8 categories. So in the character category, there are 11 genes, including the optimism gene, the shyness gene, and the moldability gene. There are 5 intelligence genes, there are 5 artistic genes, and 5 emotion genes, including propensity for teenage romance gene. So, on our blog at the Center for Genetics and Society, we have this regular feature, the Gene of the Week feature. And, you know, I mean, it's kind of crazy because genetic scientists are more and more finding that the idea of a gene, a trait, is just wrong. That there are so many interactions, gene to regulatory sequences in the DNA, environment to gene, that all this is so complicated that the idea that we can predict is really, you know, we're not going to be able to predict. The truth of the matter is, though, that there are still some people who not only want to predict, they actually want to control what kinds of genetic profiles in our future generations we have. And I'm going to skip over some things now. I'm sorry to have to skip over the Viking sperm donors and the doctoral donors here. The question of sex selection and a new kind of fetal gene test that will be able to be given to women early in pregnancy, early in their first trimester, and give women the kind of reports that you get now from 23andMe about a fetus that is like 7 weeks along. So lots of questions, ethical and moral questions in relationship to that. But I don't want to stop without mentioning Gattaca. And the final show of hands, how many people have seen Gattaca? Right? That's kind of the touchstone for I think, you know, a lot of generations now. And, you know, this is just, all the things I've told you until this slide are happening now, not just in laboratories, but most of them on the market. This is not. You know, we haven't tried to change the genes of our children. And most people would consider it highly unethical to do that kind of experiment on future human beings. But the unfortunate thing is that there are reputable scientists at eminent institutions who think we ought to go this way. And that's one of the things that actually, you know, I expend some of my stomach lining on. And I think that this idea, the very idea, I think, is really, you know, would take us so much down the wrong path. Many of the questions about human biotechnologies are really balancing acts. This one, I think we know we're not going there. But when we think about these balancing acts, I think this is just to say there's all these different technologies and practices and products. We need a new biopolitics. And as we try to keep our balance in this new world, I think we have to weigh different kinds of moral and ethical goods against each other, and it's not easy. It's typically not easy. We often are going to need to weigh individual autonomy and liberty against social justice, the public interest, and the common good. We're also going to have to weigh what we leave to the free market and what we want to address with public policy and public oversight. And I think personally and socially, we're going to have to think about how much we want to approach these powerful new technologies with you know, uncritical celebration and enthusiasm, and how much we want to take a tip from what a lot of environmentalists are telling us, that we need to approach powerful technologies with caution. And finally, I think what we can all agree on is that we really need to not leave these questions just to scientists and experts. These are questions in democratic societies where we need to encourage widespread discussion and public participation, because these technologies really will shape our families, our lives, and our societies in the future. So thank you.